All right, let's jump right in. We're tackling some pretty big ideas today, the kind that can really make or break a business.
Then it all boils down to change, right?
Exactly. Change is the one constant. There's that great quote by Joseph Schumpeter. Sooner or later, something fundamental in your business world will change. And he hit the nail on the head there.
Because we're not just talking about minor tweaks. We're talking about those seismic shifts, those moments when everything you thought you knew about your industry gets flipped on its head. We call these strategic inflection points.
And, from the material you sent, it seems like you're really interested in getting a better handle on how to spot these things and, more importantly, how to deal with them.
Absolutely. And your sources really lay out some great frameworks for understanding these pivotal moments. They've got real-world examples and then kind of a conceptual approach, too. So our mission today, if you will, is to pull out the key insights, the really actionable stuff you can use. How do you know when you're facing one of these strategic inflection points, and what do you do about it?
Perfect. Let's get into it. So often, these strategic inflection points, they're triggered by what's called a 10x change.
Right, not just a little bump in the road, like we're talking a tenfold change, a huge change.
Massive.
Yeah.
In one or more of the fundamental forces that affect a business, like the ground rules just change completely.
Yeah, the whole game shifts. And the sources lay out 6 key forces that can drive these 10x changes. So let's walk through them. The first, and probably the most obvious one, is competition.
Right, like when a giant enters the scene. Right.
Exactly. The classic example in the sources is Walmart. I mean, when Walmart moved into a new market, existing retailers, they suddenly had a whole new level of competition to deal with. It was massive. And it wasn't just about prices. Walmart also brought this whole new approach to logistics and supply chain management. It was a game changer.
Totally different ballgame. And it's not always about a traditional competitor, right? Like someone doing the same thing, but better. Sometimes it's a whole new type of player entering the market.
Exactly. And that's what we see with the rise of software companies, right? They've disrupted so many industries, from media to retail to finance. And the interesting thing is, they often come in with a completely different set of strengths and a totally different business model. So the existing players, they're not just competing on features or price anymore. They're competing on a whole new level.
It's like the whole definition of what it means to compete changes. And then, of course, there's technology. That's a huge driver of 10x change.
Always has been, always will be.
Your sources have some great examples of the shift from silent movies to talkies. Imagine what that did to Hollywood. The whole industry had to adapt.
The studios, the actors, even the theaters, they all had to retool. And it wasn't just a technical change. It was a change in the art form itself.
Yeah, the whole way stories were told. And then there's containerization in the shipping industry.
Yeah.
That was a total revolution.
Absolutely. Before containerization, loading and unloading ships, it was this incredibly labor-intensive process. But with containers, everything became standardized, efficient. It dramatically reduced costs and sped up shipping times.
Changed global trade forever.
Yeah, it really did. And then there's, of course, the personal computer revolution. I mean, that story is just full of 10x changes. And the sources really highlight the tale of denial aspect of it.
Where some of the big established companies, they just didn't see it coming, right? Or they underestimated it.
Totally. They were so focused on their existing business models, their mainframe computers, that they missed the potential of these smaller, cheaper, more accessible PCs.
So it's not just that technology changes, it's that it can completely redefine what good even means in an industry. And if you're not paying attention, you can get left behind very quickly.
Absolutely. Like what used to be the gold standard, the cutting edge, can suddenly become obsolete. And the companies that are slow to adapt, they often pay the price.
Okay, moving on. We've got customers.
Right. Your customers, they're the lifeblood of your business. And they're not static.
Their needs and their tastes, they change. And when they do, that can create huge ripples.
Yeah. Your sources mention shifting tastes in cars as an example. Like at one point, big gas-guzzling cars were all the rage, but then concerns about fuel efficiency and the environment started to grow, and suddenly smaller, more fuel-efficient cars were in demand.
That's a massive shift for car manufacturers.
Huge. Their whole design and production processes have to adapt. And it's not just about the tangible features, right? There are also changes in attitudes, perceptions.
Like how people view a brand. or what they associate with a product.
Exactly. And your sources talk about this double whammy in the supercomputer industry, where it wasn't just that technology changed rapidly, but the customer's needs also evolved dramatically.
So you have these twin forces of change hitting the industry at the same time.
Yeah, it's like getting hit from both sides. And that makes it even harder to navigate.
All right, what about suppliers? How can they be a source of 10x change?
Well, think about it. Your suppliers, they provide the essential ingredients for your business, right? So if there's a major shift in that relationship, it can have a huge impact.
Like if a key supplier suddenly raises their prices, or if there's a shortage of a critical component.
Exactly. Or if the balance of power shifts. The sources give the example of the airline industry, where over time, the airlines gained more and more bargaining power. They consolidated, and they started to dictate terms to the companies that supplied them with aircraft and other essential services.
So suddenly the suppliers had less leverage, and the airlines had more control.
Yeah, it's the classic power shift. And then there's this interesting example about the end of second sourcing.
Second sourcing. What's that?
Well, it was this practice where companies would have multiple suppliers for a critical component. It was a way to hedge their bets to make sure they weren't reliant on just one supplier. But then, for efficiency reasons, a lot of companies moved away from that model.
So they streamlined their supply chains.
Yes.
But it made them more vulnerable.
Right. If something went wrong with their single supplier, they were in trouble.
Exactly. So you see, even seemingly small changes in supplier relationships can have big consequences.
All right, next up we have complementers. This one's a little less obvious.
Yeah, complementers, they're those products or services that enhance the value of your own offering. Think of it like apps on a smartphone.
Right. The more apps there are, the more usable and appealing the smartphone becomes.
Exactly. And the sources point out that changes in this complementary ecosystem, they can have a big impact on your business. New complementers can emerge or existing ones can evolve, and that can create new opportunities, but also new threats.
So you need to be aware of what's happening in that broader ecosystem, how it's changing, and how those changes might affect you.
Absolutely. You can't just focus on your own little piece of the puzzle. You have to understand how it fits into the larger picture.
And finally, we have regulation. And this is a big one, right? Because government policies can completely reshape industries. Oh yeah. The sources give the example of patent medicines. There was a time when these medicines, with all sorts of dubious claims, were widely sold, but then regulations were put in place to protect consumers, and the whole industry pretty much collapsed.
Wow, just wiped out by regulation. And then there's the telecom industry. Huge changes there driven by regulation.
Remember AT&T? Before 1968, they had this massive monopoly on telephone service in the U.S.?
I've heard story. It was like the only game in town.
Pretty much. But then the government started to open up the market to competition, and eventually AT&T was broken up. And that led to this explosion of innovation and competition in the telecom industry.
It's amazing how much power regulation has to shape an industry. And it's not just about specific rules and restrictions, right? There's also the broader trend of privatization, where governments sell off state-owned enterprises.
Right. That changes the whole competitive landscape, introduces new players, new incentives.
So we've got these 6 forces that can drive 10x change: competition, technology, customers, suppliers, complementers, and regulation.
And the key is to be constantly aware of these forces, to be thinking about how they might be shifting and how those shifts could impact your business. Because if you can anticipate these changes, you have a much better chance of navigating them successfully.
Right, so it's all about being proactive, not reactive. But how do you actually see these strategic inflection points coming? It doesn't seem like there's always a giant flashing warning sign.
No, not always. But there are often early signals, clues that something fundamental is changing, and the sources talk about how this recognition often happens in stages.
Okay, so what's the first stage? What are some of those early warning signs?
It often starts with this kind of nagging feeling, a sense that something's different. Like you might notice that customer attitudes are shifting or that previously successful teams are starting to struggle.
Or maybe you see unexpected competitors starting to gain traction.
Exactly. And sometimes it's even more subtle, like the sources mention this example of the atmosphere at industry trade shows feeling off.
Off? In what way? Like people are less enthusiastic? Or the focus has shifted in some unexpected way?
Precisely. It's just this general feeling that the old patterns, the old dynamics, they're not quite there anymore.
Interesting. So it's like a gut feeling almost.
Yeah, kind of. And it's not always easy to articulate, but it's important to pay attention to it. Because this initial unease, it can then evolve into a more clear dissonance, a gap between how the company sees itself and the emerging reality of the market.
Right, like the company's clinging to its old story, but the market's telling a different story.
Exactly. And the sources point out that often the first people to sense these shifts, they're the ones on the front lines. Middle managers, especially those in sales.
Because they're the ones directly interacting with customers, seeing what the competitors are up to.
They're in the trenches, and they have this unfiltered view of what's really happening. The sources tell this great anecdote about a concerned field report. It was just this one observation from a sales rep, something that seemed relatively minor at the time, but it turned out to be an early warning sign of a much bigger shift in the market.
So the lesson there is to really listen to those on the ground, those who are closest to the action.
Absolutely. And as a leader, you have to create a culture where people feel comfortable sharing those observations, even if they're not always positive.
Right, because sometimes the most valuable information comes from unexpected sources. It's about being open to different perspectives.
Exactly. And the sources really emphasize the importance of actively seeking out diverse viewpoints. Talk to your customers, both the ones who are staying with you and the ones you've lost.
The ones you've lost, that's an interesting one. Why them specifically?
Because they can often give you the most honest feedback. They're not worried about jeopardizing the relationship, so they'll tell you what they really think, why they chose a competitor, what they were looking for that you didn't offer. It can be really valuable insight.
Makes sense. And it's not just about customers, right?
Wow.
Talk to employees at all levels. Encourage them to share what they're seeing.
And even listen to your critics, the journalists, the analysts. They often have a different lens on your business, and they can point out things that you might be blind to. It's about gathering as much information as you can from as many sources as you can.
Right. It's about getting the full picture, seeing the forest for the trees.
And then it's about trying to separate the signal from the noise.
Because not every little blip on the radar is a sign of a major shift.
Right. You have to learn to filter.
Now, the sources offer a really compelling case study, the transformation of the computer industry. That's a classic example of a strategic inflection point, right?
That's a textbook example. It shows how a whole industry can be completely reshaped.
So can you walk us through that? What were the key changes?
The computer industry went through a fundamental shift from a model that was dominated by these vertically integrated giants, companies like IBM, Digital, Sperry, Burroughs, Unisys. These were companies that controlled pretty much every aspect of the product, from design and manufacturing to sales and service.
It was like a one-stop shop for everything computer-related.
Exactly. But then the personal computer revolution came along, and everything changed.
Because PCs were different, right? They were smaller, more affordable, and they were built on standardized components.
Right. And that led to the rise of a whole new set of companies. Companies like Intel, Microsoft, Compaq, and HP. And these companies specialized in different parts of the value chain. Intel made the microprocessors, Microsoft provided the operating system, Compaq assembled the PCs, and HP focused on printers and other peripherals.
So it shifted from a vertical structure to a more horizontal one.
Exactly, and that changed the whole game. The old rules for success no longer applied.
So what were the new rules? How did companies have to adapt to this new horizontal structure?
Well, in the old vertically integrated world, success was often tied to having the most comprehensive, the most sophisticated solution. It was about proprietary technology, about building everything yourself, about controlling the whole stack.
It was about being the best, most advanced end-to-end solution.
Right. But in the new, horizontally structured world, things were different. Cost management became absolutely crucial. You had to be able to produce your components or systems very efficiently to compete on price.
Because PCs were becoming commodities, right? There were a lot of players in the market.
Exactly. And that meant you had to be able to keep your costs down. And then there was the issue of standards. Embracing industry standards became essential because in a horizontal industry where different companies are making different parts of the system, those parts have to work together seamlessly.
So compatibility became key.
Huge. And that was a big shift from the old world of proprietary technology, where companies often tried to lock customers into their own ecosystem. In the PC world, a better PC that couldn't run the standard software, it was basically a failure.
It's fascinating how the definition of better changed. It went from meaning proprietary excellence to meaning compatibility and affordability.
Exactly. It was a complete paradigm shift. And some of the big players from the old world, they really struggled to adapt. Some of them, like Unisys, they eventually shifted their focus towards software and services. They kind of adapted to the new horizontal structure. But others, they faced some really tough challenges.
And ultimately, some of them didn't make it.
Right. Because they couldn't let go of that old way of thinking, that old way of doing business.
The sources also delve into Intel's own experience with a major strategic inflection point, and that's the memory business crisis.
It sounds like this was a really formative experience for the company.
It was. It was a defining moment.
So what happened? How did it all unfold? Well, in the early 1980s, Intel was a pioneer in the memory business. They were one of the leading producers of memory chips. But then they faced this overwhelming competitive force from Japanese memory producers.
And the Japanese companies, they were really good at high-volume, low-cost manufacturing, right?
They were, and they flooded the market with cheap memory chips. And for Intel, this was a really tough challenge because memory chips, they were a core part of their identity. Intel equaled memories, as the sources put it.
So it was more than just a business decision. It was an emotional issue.
Absolutely. It was about who they were as a company. And internally, there was a lot of debate about how to respond to this challenge.
So what were some of the options on the table?
Well, some people argued that Intel should double down on memory production, try to compete with the Japanese head-on cost and scale.
Go big or go home kind of thing.
Yeah. Others thought that Intel should focus on developing more cutting-edge memory technologies, stuff that would be harder for the Japanese companies to replicate. And then there were those who thought Intel should focus on niche markets, specialized memory products.
So lots of different ideas, lots of different opinions.
And all this debate, it led to a period of paralysis. Intel was wandering in the valley of death, as the sources put it. They were losing money, and they weren't sure what to do.
It sounds like a really tough time. So how did they eventually get out of that valley?
Well, it involved making a really difficult decision, and that was to exit the memory business, to walk away from something that had been so central to their identity.
That must have been incredibly hard.
It was. It faced a lot of internal resistance, but the leadership team, they eventually realized that they had to make this tough call.
And what was the reaction from their customers?
Surprisingly, it was pretty muted. By that point, the customers had already realized that Intel was no longer a major player in the memory market, and they had already started to look for alternative suppliers.
So it wasn't as big a deal as they thought it would be?
Exactly. And the really interesting thing is, exiting the memory business, it freed up Intel's resources, and it allowed them to focus on their microprocessor business.
Of course, that turned out to be a huge success.
Massive. So in a way, that strategic inflection point, it was a blessing in disguise. It forced Intel to let go of something that was no longer working and to focus on what would ultimately become their core strength.
Okay, so back to recognizing these changes.
Yeah.
The sources talk a lot about the challenge of distinguishing between signal and noise.
Right, because not every little blip is a sign of a major shift. You got to be able to filter.
So how do you do that? How do you know what to pay attention to?
The sources give a couple of good examples here. The first is X-ray technology for chip manufacturing. Now, at one point, this was identified as a potentially revolutionary technology, but at the time, it wasn't really ready for prime time. It wasn't mature enough for mass production.
So it was a potential 10x force, but not quite there yet.
Right. But the key takeaway is, even though it wasn't an immediate threat, it was something that Intel had to keep an eye on. Because sometimes what's noise today can become a very important signal tomorrow.
So you can't just dismiss things out of hand. You have to keep them on your radar.
Exactly. You have to have that peripheral vision.
And they contrast that with the RISC versus CISC debate in processor design.
Right. So RISC and CISC, those are two different approaches to processor architecture. And internally at Intel, there were some pretty strong arguments in favor of the RISC approach. But then the market overwhelmingly embraced Intel's 486 processor, which was a CISC processor.
So the market spoke.
Loudly. And that sent a very clear signal, a signal that basically ended the internal debate. The market adoption, it validated the CISC approach, and that allowed Intel to focus its development efforts accordingly.
It's interesting how sometimes the market just gives you the answer.
It does, and it's important to listen, because you can have all the internal debates you want, but ultimately it's the market that decides what wins.
The sources also talk about the silver bullet test. Can you explain what that is and how it can help identify important shifts?
So the silver bullet test, it's this thought experiment. You ask yourself, if you had one shot, one silver bullet, To take out a competitor, who would it be? And your answer, it usually reveals who you see as your most dangerous competitor, your biggest threat.
Because that's who you'd be most worried about, right?
Exactly. And when that answer starts to change, when someone who wasn't previously on your radar suddenly becomes your biggest concern, that's a sign that the competitive landscape is shifting.
It's a sign that things are changing and you need to pay attention.
Absolutely.
And it's not just about looking at the obvious competitors, right? The sources also talk about the importance of peripheral vision.
Right. That's about looking beyond the obvious, paying attention to things that might seem tangential, like reading industry news from other parts of the world or talking to employees at lower levels of the organization. They often have a different perspective, and they can pick up on signals that others might miss.
It's about gathering information from a wide range of sources.
Exactly, because you never know where the next big change is going to come from.
Okay, so let's say you've recognized a strategic inflection point. Now comes the really hard part. How do you actually respond effectively?
This is where the rubber meets the road, because recognizing the change is only half the battle.
The other half is doing something about it.
Right. And the sources talk about a number of common mistakes that companies make when facing these kinds of situations.
So what's mistake number one?
Well, one of the biggest pitfalls is what's called the trap of the first version. The classic example here is the original Apple Macintosh. Now, by some technical measures, the first Mac, it was pretty weak compared to the PCs that were out there at the time. It didn't have a hard drive. It was relatively slow.
It had its limitations.
It did. And some people looked at those limitations and they dismissed the Mac as a toy, a niche product. But what they missed was the truly revolutionary technology that was underneath, the graphical user interface, and the consistency of experience that it offered.
So they were focused on the wrong things. They were looking at the surface instead of the substance.
Exactly. And the lesson there is, don't get hung up on the initial limitations of a new technology. Look beyond the first version and try to see the underlying potential.
Because sometimes the real innovation is hidden beneath the surface.
Exactly.
Okay, what about the decision-making process during these periods of significant change? How should companies approach that?
The sources emphasize the value of debate, of having really robust discussions about the situation. Don't expect everyone to agree immediately, but the process of articulating different perspectives, it helps everyone to develop a clearer understanding of the challenges and the potential paths forward.
So it's about having those tough conversations, even if they're uncomfortable.
Exactly. And it's about creating a culture where people feel safe to challenge the status quo, to question assumptions.
Because sometimes the best ideas come from the most unexpected sources.
Right. And it's important to remember that these debates, they're not about winning or losing. They're about sharpening everyone's thinking, about getting to the best possible solution.
Okay, but there's a risk of getting stuck in endless debate.
Yeah.
Right. How do you know when to move from discussion to action?
That's a good point. And it's a balance. You need to have enough debate to ensure that you're making informed decisions, but you can't let it paralyze you. At some point, you have to make a call and move forward.
And what about the role of data in all of this? Data is usually seen as so important in business.
And it is. But the sources make an interesting point about data. They say that while data is essential for understanding the past, it can be misleading when you're trying to navigate the future.
Because the past doesn't always predict the future.
Exactly. Especially when you're dealing with these kinds of fundamental changes. By the time the data definitively confirms the impact of a 10x change, it might be too late.
So you can't wait for the data to tell you what to do. You have to trust your gut, your intuition.
To some extent, yes. But it's not about ignoring data altogether. It's about understanding its limitations and using it in conjunction with your experience, your judgment, and your understanding of the industry.
It's about being able to connect the dots, to see the patterns that the data might not reveal.
Exactly. And it's about having that healthy dose of paranoia, that sense of unease that keeps you constantly scanning the horizon.
Okay, so we've talked about the trap of the first version and the importance of debate and intuition. What are some other common mistakes that companies make when facing strategic inflection points?
Well, one of the big ones is filtering bad news. As information moves up the chain of command, it often gets sanitized, the negative stuff gets filtered out, and that can be really dangerous because it creates this distorted view of reality at the top.
So the leaders are making decisions based on incomplete information.
Exactly. And the sources tell this cautionary tale about a company that ultimately went out of business because senior management was never really aware of how bad things were.
Wow, that's a sobering thought.
It is. And then there's this tendency for senior managers to engage in distractions and avoidance behaviors when they're facing a crisis.
What do you mean by that?
Well, instead of tackling the core strategic challenge head on, they might focus on things that seem less threatening, less risky, like pursuing unrelated acquisitions or getting overly involved in charitable fundraising or pet projects, things that make them feel busy and productive but don't actually address the real problem.
So it's like they're avoiding the elephant in the room.
Exactly. And it's understandable, right? These situations can be incredibly stressful, and it's human nature to want to avoid the hard stuff. But the problem is, if you don't address the core issue, it's just going to get worse.
And then there's what the sources call the inertia of success. What is that?
That's the tendency to stick with what's worked in the past, even when it's no longer working. And it's especially common in companies that have been very successful. They've got this playbook that's worked for them, and they're reluctant to change it, even when the market's telling them they need to.
It's like they're stuck in a rut.
Yeah. And the longer they stay in that rut, the harder it is to get out.
So what's the antidote to all of this?
Yeah.
What are some proactive steps that companies can take?
Well, first and foremost, early action is critical. Don't wait until the crisis is full-blown before you start to make changes. Leverage what the sources call the business bubble. That's the period when your core business is still strong, when you have the resources and the flexibility to make big bets.
So strike while the iron's hot.
Exactly. Because the consequences of being too early are generally less severe than the consequences of being too late.
Right. And you also need to define what you're not going to be.
That's a good point. It's about making choices, about deciding what to focus on and what to let go of. And sometimes it's easier to define what you're not going to be after you've gone through a difficult period.
Like after Intel exited the memory business, they knew they didn't want to be in that game anymore.
Exactly. And that clarity, it allowed them to focus their energy and resources on their core strength, microprocessors.
Okay, so early action, defining what you're not going to be. What else?
Redeploy your resources. This is absolutely critical. You have to shift your financial capital, your people, your time away from the old and towards the new.
So it's about putting your money where your mouth is.
Exactly. And the sources point out that one of the most powerful signals of a company's true priorities is the CEO's calendar. Where does the CEO spend their time? What meetings do they attend? Who do they meet with?
Because that shows what's really important, right?
It does, and it sends a very powerful message to the rest of the organization.
The sources also talk about leading via strategic actions. What does that mean?
It means that actions speak louder than words. It's not enough to just talk about change. You have to actually do things differently.
So it's about walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
Exactly. And the sources highlight the importance of incremental, consistent actions that reinforce the desired future state. It's about making small changes day after day that gradually move the organization in the right direction.
So it's a marathon, not a sprint.
Right. And they present this framework called the resource shift dilemma, which highlights the importance of timing.
Timing, how so?
Well, there are three basic scenarios. You can shift resources too prematurely before there's really clear evidence that the shift is necessary. You can shift them at the optimal time when your current business is still strong, but there's early evidence that things are changing. Or you can shift them too late, after you've already lost momentum.
And obviously the goal is to hit that sweet spot, right? To shift resources at the optimal time.
Exactly. But that can be tricky. It requires careful judgment and a willingness to make tough calls.
Okay, once you've decided on a new strategic direction, what's the key role of leadership?
Well, first and foremost, it's about communicating that direction clearly and unambiguously. Everyone in the organization needs to understand where you're going and why.
And that communication, it needs to come from the top.
Absolutely. The CEO has to be the champion of the new strategy. And it's not just about words. The CEO has to model the desired behaviors, to embody the new values.
So it's about walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
Exactly. And the sources point out that sometimes it's actually helpful to overcorrect initially to really drive the message home.
Overcorrect, how so?
Well, let's say you're trying to shift the company towards a more customer-centric culture. You might start by making some very visible changes, like changing the way customer service is handled or giving employees more autonomy to solve customer problems. And you might even go overboard at first to make sure that everyone gets the message.
So it's about sending a clear signal that things are changing.
Exactly. And the sources also talk about the importance of using technology to communicate broadly and efficiently.
Like company-wide emails.
Right. That's a great way to get the message out to everyone quickly and to make sure that everyone's on the same page. And it also allows for feedback and questions, which is important.
It creates a dialogue.
Exactly.
The sources give a good example of a company that's been really successful at adapting to change, and that's Hewlett-Packard.
Yeah, HP has a long history of navigating strategic inflection points. They've moved from mechanical calculators to electronic calculators to mini computers to PCs to printers to services. They've constantly reinvented themselves.
And that's what's allowed them to stay relevant.
Absolutely.
The sources also talk about the strategic planning process itself and how it needs to adapt to these times of rapid change.
Right. The traditional model of top-down strategic planning, where the executives come up with a plan and then hand it down to the rest of the organization, it's not very effective in these situations because things are changing so quickly that the plan is often outdated by the time it's implemented.
So what's a better approach?
The sources advocate for a more dynamic, more collaborative approach, where there's a constant dialogue between those with deep, focused knowledge at different levels of the organization and those with a broader, more strategic perspective.
So it's about tapping into the collective intelligence of the organization.
Exactly. And it's about creating a culture where people feel empowered to share their ideas, to challenge assumptions, and to experiment.
Because in these times of rapid change, the